Well, hello, Patrick.
Hello, India Jane. Thank you very much for instigating this.
Well, it's taken years, hasn't it? So here we are. And maybe, I don't really know where to start, but maybe you should explain a little bit about what you do, who you are, and touching on why.
Okay, well, I think the reason why India Jane suggested that we should have this exchange and conversation tonight is because she knew, well, we've known each other for many years.
Yes.
And indeed, I've known quite a few members of your family and your extended family.
Apparently you do, yes.
Your half-brothers, Zach and Ben. And also I met your mother a few times, and her second husband.
Jimmy. Yeah, and Teddy.
And Teddy Goldsmith, who's the founder of The Ecologist. So you've got all those connections. But I guess you suggested this because you knew about my involvement with food and farming for a long time. And I imagine that quite a bit of the interest might have brought you here, and thank you very much for coming, is that because you know that I've had a long involvement with farming in practice at a farm in West Wales, where I've been for more than 50 years. And now it's the longest established organic dairy farm in Wales, where we milk cows and make cheese and grow vegetables. And that long experience has been the foundation stone for two other jobs I've had, day jobs. The first of which was working for the Soil Association, which was spanned about 20 years until 2010. And then since then, I've set up another organization, the Sustainable Food Trust, which works internationally to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. And so between the two, the practice and the advocacy or the external engagement, I guess that's given me quite a lot of grounding in this subject. So I imagine you'd probably want to know something about that. But because this is a very unusual gathering, I wanted to explore something. I want to sort of preface that discussion, if I may,
yes,
by talking about my own parallel interest, which I think is directly related to the worldly questions about our food and our farming practice and its impact on the planet and on the environment and on our health, with inner search. And I thought it would be a good way to set the scene would be to describe the circumstances of a gathering of farmers in East Germany, which took place 101 years ago. In fact, interesting, this was a man called Rudolf Steiner, who's the founder of anthroposophy, but also biodynamic farming. And he was a teacher, a man who had higher knowledge, and he had access. You could say he was a spiritual scientist. There are lots of words to describe him, well known for his work in education. But in June 1924, some East German farmers who were concerned about the declining vitality of their crops and their livestock asked him if he'd speak to them about why this might be the case and what could be done about it. And he gave these lectures 100 years ago, and he died actually a year after this. He died on the 30th of March, 2026. So we are almost celebrating the 101st anniversary of his death. And he gave these extraordinary lectures which formed the basis of biodynamic farming. And obviously I can't paraphrase the lectures, but what essentially he said was that organic life on Earth is like a sort of vast receptor and an interface between the cosmic forces of the universe and the mineral of the planet. And organic life on Earth has a sort of digestion function. It mediates between these two extremes, energetic extremes. And that because of the activities of human beings, which were already starting to transform the planet's landscape, and particularly in farming, were starting to become more chemical, it was starting to degrade the integrity of the capacity of this organic receptor to play its role. And he said that farmers could take certain steps to regain or refine the vitality of the crops and the animals that they were growing. And specifically, he said they should plant and harvest according to the movements of the planetary bodies against the background of the zodiac, of the constellations. He said that they should use preparations which you might call homeopathic preparations, which would potentize the manures and the composts that they would use to fertilize the crops. But he also said the human being is not separate from the farming system. If the farm is an ecosystem, the person who is farming is a part of that ecosystem. And I studied biodynamic agriculture at Emerson College in Sussex in 1972-3, having already decided I wanted to get back to the land. And one of those pictures is me with long hair sitting on a tractor, and that was the first year we arrived at Holden. And we were a group of 6. We set up a community farm. My daughter Barley, who's here, was born literally just a few weeks after we arrived. And our intention right from the start was to try to farm in harmony with nature. We were very naive, but that was what we wanted to do. And after we arrived, before we arrived, somebody who can't be here, Jennifer Elton Wilson, became involved with a teaching about which I knew nothing, a Russian teacher, and she started going to a group, and I didn't really know what she was doing. Anyway, this turned out to be a Gurdjieff group, and some years after we arrived at the farm, I read In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Uspensky, and that inspired me, and that was what took me to the work, the Gurdjieff work. A lot of people here are involved with the Gurdjieff teaching, but not everyone, so I'll try to just not use any weird and esoteric language, or if that's what I have a tendency to do. And one of the chapters in Search of the Miraculous is a chapter about the food table. And I read it and was slightly overwhelmed by it because there's quite a lot of maths and a fair bit of chemistry in it. And I had a sense that there was something important there, but I was just reading it intellectually. And I couldn't, there's this phrase, trust but verify. Well, I trusted it, but I couldn't really verify it, so I sort of put that chapter down. But I came back to it just quite recently and read it again. And what was really interesting, and it's not the first time that I've found this about books relating to the Gurdjieff teaching, that sometimes you can read something and you take it intellectually, but then much, much later you can read it again and you can understand it on another level. And that's what I felt about the food table. So I'll try and just say what I found from it the second time, which is that he described the human organism as a factory, which seem to be quite a weird analogy to make these days, but a factory taking in food, 3 kinds of food, physical food, air, and food of our senses, both our obvious sort of senses of taste and sound and sight, but also more subtle, energetic senses. And he said that all human beings need to take in all 3 kinds of these food for our existence. And that in normal conditions, a human being can survive very well taking in these foods which we are programmed to eat or receive, but we waste a lot of the potential, both in terms of the way we take in these foods and how much of them I'm not sure if the right word is metabolize, but how much of them we utilize for a higher purpose, because our normal existence is very wasteful with negative thoughts and just many, many wasteful processes. And even the receipt of those 3 kinds of food, the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the impressions that we receive from nature in particular, but just general impressions, are not utilized to their potential, or maybe you could say to our potential to serve something higher. And in the same chapter, he refers to how a person who is more present or has worked on themselves might be able to receive more from the air they breathe than a person who is not more developed, and take in some substances which might be in the air but most people wouldn't take in, and that fascinated me. And then he also said that a person who is more present to the impressions that they receive, more of them are received. And that's anybody who's involved with any sort of mindfulness, meditation, prayer, practice of that kind. I think, well, I'm just speaking for myself now. I can say that if I am more present, then all the impressions, I know from my own experience, the impressions that I receive when I'm more present are more intense, and I can almost feel as if I, as it were, metabolize them in a different way than if I'm just, if I have no attention and my attention is scattered. And so all this I saw much more clearly from reading this chapter on the food table again. But what really struck me was that I didn't really read anything specific. I mean, Rudolf Steiner went into this a great deal, but I didn't read anything specific about food and the way our food is produced. Steiner said that we should move back to a biological agriculture and avoid chemical agriculture, because this would degrade the capacity to produce vital food. So there's a clue there, but it wasn't mentioned in Ouspensky's books, and I don't think it's really been mentioned very much in any of the workbooks, the Gurdjieff workbooks that I've read. But I think it's really interesting, because during the last century, if it was becoming bad when Rudolf Steiner gave his talks in 1924, I can tell you it's got a whole lot worse. And this is not meant to be, I'm not trying to sound depressing, but I just think it's important that more people should know the consequences of a century of industrialized and increasingly chemical agriculture on the quality of the food that we eat. And I think, going back to what I was saying about how important it is, or whether it's important or not, for us to eat intelligent food, I think it's very important. But I also am aware, in saying that, there are people in Gaza or in the prison camps throughout history, or people who've had terrible diets and have refined themselves spiritually. So clearly, it's not as if you can say, only if I have wonderful food can I be a realized human being. But I feel there's something important there, because if you take the whole population of planet Earth, you degrade its agriculture, bring it from the vital to the biological to the chemical, and you at the same time degrade the complexity and the beauty of all the ecosystems that used to be part of agriculture but no longer part of it, there must be consequences. And it sort of reminds me of what Ouspensky said about the good citizen, the good obyvatel, which is the foundation stone of spiritual work, if you think that it is. You could say with everybody is eating degraded food, it cannot be good for civilization. And I think some of the consequences that are playing out, so for instance, declining public health, lower vitality, I think you can see this. You can see this particularly in Western populations. And I feel that it's important to at least know that these processes have happened and they're continuing to happen.
Yes. I mean, a farmer in 1924 would have been concerned with these questions. I've written them down. And it's how life actually comes into being, how it behaves, how it evolves, how it decays, and what the living in itself actually is, and how to access that. I mean, these are farmers talking about crops, but these are very big questions. And with a chemical setup, it becomes less important. And now we have robotic farming, so it's even less important. You have whole fields in Kansas, I think, just being weeded and sprayed by robots, gigantic robots. So what is actually lost, this vitality in food, and I totally agree with you, but what is it? And, you know, I've always known that soil is the basis for human health. In fact, the root of the word human is humus, same as soil, compost. So what actually is lost, and why is it so important? Because the way I feel is that an irradiated bit of food from a supermarket, and it's all irradiated to make it last longer, how does it serve the person at all? What, can it be transformed, or is it just too dead? Something can be too dead.
Well, I think one of the problems is that we don't really have very good ways of measuring the vitality of food. There's a process called sensitive crystallization where you can take some food substances and you can mix them in a metallic salt and crystallize them. And a lot of biodynamic researchers have used that, and you get these incredible crystal pictures where you can sort of see forms which seem to be reflecting vitality. But you can't really have one of those crystal pictures, you know, when you go shopping in Waitrose or wherever you go. And I think what is really interesting is whether we will be able to develop ways in which we can reveal the vitality of food. And there's this man called Dan Kitteridge who set up an organization called the Bionutrient Association. He's a son of one of the early organic pioneer horticultural producers in Massachusetts. And he basically has cottoned onto the fact that the distant planets emit photon emissions, which you can tell what they're made of. And he thought, why couldn't you do this for plant and animal products? So basically, he said, it involves quite a lot of research. You've got to, so he's collecting data on carrots, and I think most people would have thought a carrot was a carrot. So he's managed to collect thousands of samples of carrot from all over America and all over Europe. And he's done a photon analysis of their nutritional composition. And it turns out that there is a vast variation of nutrient density between different carrots. And what he's trying to do at the moment is correlate where those carrots came from and how they were grown. And then once he's got enough data, he thinks it might be possible, I don't know if it will be, he might actually be possible to sort of have one of these gizmos and, you know, hold it in front of a carrot and find out how nutritionally dense it is, or maybe how much vitality it has. So I was with him at a conference in Arles last year in south of France, and I said, if there were two measurements, one for plants and one for animal products, that you would try to get when you were doing these photo emissions, what would they be? And he said for plants it would be secondary metabolites, and I don't know if you know what they are, but they're basically the plant's immune system. So all plants manufacture these compounds which they mobilize when they have a pest or disease threat or a fungal threat or something like that. And they enable the plant to withstand the pest and disease challenge. And our palates and our tongues and everything have become evolved to taste these secondary metabolites, because those same immune substances are good for us as well. So when we taste something delicious, if it hasn't been artificially manufactured by flavorists, which are now, that's common in many foods, as India Jane was saying, that you're actually tasting the plant's health. And so he said if you could measure the secondary metabolites in vegetables or plant materials and the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratios in livestock products, so that would be the dairy products, meat, any livestock product, it'll have an omega-6, omega-3 fatty acid ratio. And if you could measure those and you could make that information accessible and you could relate it to different farming systems, if you could do all that, there's a lot of ifs there, that might enable people who eat food, which of course everyone, to use your buying power to push things in a different direction. Because at the moment, and may I say just one more thing about the quality of food that we're eating in supermarkets at the moment, because this might sound a bit depressing, but nearly all the food that you buy in supermarkets today is not that good. And I'll give you, just to give you a few examples. So most of the vegetables that supermarkets sell today, even the organic ones, are grown in relatively few areas in very large monocultures. The organic ones are definitely better than the chemical ones, but they're still not grown in a very proper holistic crop rotation. But the non-organic ones, say carrots or brassicas or anything really, they're mostly grown in the fens near places like Ely and Boston in Lincolnshire, where there are these vast areas of polder type lands, which is high organic matter, where it doesn't rain that much and the soils are very bomb-proof, so you can go on them 365 days a year. And they're just grown vegetables every year. They're incredibly carbon extractive, so they're mining all the organic matter in the soils. But worse than that, because they're just using very long crop rotations without any fertility building, they're using a huge number of pesticides, including herbicides, pesticides and fungicides to control the weeds, pests and diseases which otherwise would get the better of the crops. So the vegetables that we're eating have got pesticide residues, they're poor in nutrition, and they're just not that good. And they taste of nothing, and that's the point, isn't it? They don't really taste like vegetables should taste like. Another example would be dairy farms. More than half the milk that is now sold in UK supermarkets comes from cows that never get out. There's a euphemism in the dairy magazines that I read called fully housed, which means they never get out. And many of the herds are now 500 cows, 1,000 cows, even 2,000 cows. So it's battery dairy farming, and it's ironic that it's been sort of banned with chickens, but it's actually going the other way with cows. And if, as we are, you're a family farm with a herd of less than 100 cows, you're unlikely to be there anymore unless you've got a day job like I've got, or we're making cheese, which just about makes us into survival mode. And so that's dairy. Chicken is the story behind a conventional chicken is so bad. If you think erroneously that it's better to eat a chicken than a bit of beef, I've got some bad news for you. It's not. You shouldn't really eat conventional chicken at all, because the story behind conventional chicken is just so awful on every level. I don't want to take too much airtime, but it's really bad.
Oh, yes. No, I grew up eating chicken, thinking it was a sort of fish, because it tasted of fish.
Yeah.
And then I think there must have been enough complaints, and they changed the fish meal all the chickens were getting to something else.
Yeah. Well, beef, and again, we're about to produce a report called, it might be called, I'm arguing it should be called, it's not the cow but the how. And it's about the role of livestock in sustainable food systems. And there's a huge debate with lots of people, including the Climate Change Committee and all the scientific elite, saying we've got to eat less meat, we should all move to a plant-based diet, and cows in particular are absolutely terrible for the climate. Well, that's not right either. So there's so much misinformation out there. So if a cow is mainly grass-fed and is umbilically related to the land that she grazes, which she should be if she's properly managed, so the cow and the soil that she's connected to are whole, really, you should, if somebody says, do cows emit methane? The answer is yes, they do. But if the cow is properly grazed and eats mainly grass, then the carbon sequestration in the soil more than offsets the methane that she emits. So the cow moves from being part of the problem to part of the solution. And what everyone's done is just lumped all cows together and said cows are bad because a cow emits this much of methane. They've separated the cow from the soil. And a lot of the the beef that we eat these days is produced in feedlots, not so much in this country, but in the US in particular. So all the scientists who said, oh, beef is terrible, have done a feedlot study, which is a mainly grain-fed animal, and they've said the methane's bad, we knew that, and they haven't calculated the positive soil calculation because there might not be any. So the science is just useless. So that's misled the whole of society into thinking that they must go plant-based, and if they don't go plant-based, they should definitely give up eating beef. When in fact, if we were to transition to properly sustainable agriculture, we wouldn't be able to do that without livestock. So if you go back to the vegetable fields of the east of England, where all these rather depressing vegetables are produced, extractively, the only way to restore the fertility of those soils is to move back to a crop rotation which has a fertility building phase, and that grass, which would probably be 50% of the rotation, can only be turned into food that we can eat through grazing animals, cows and sheep, dairy cows, beef cows, sheep. And that is the diet that we ought to be eating. And some of you might be thinking, well, if we did this at scale, would we be able to feed ourselves? Because that's a critical question, because the other thing is, first of all, you know, this sort of cattle farming is terrible for climate change. There's lots of myths going on, but the big one is, oh, we'd all starve if we went organic or equivalent. But we did a study, the Sustainable Food Trust, which we published in 2022, called Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, where we did a modelling exercise assuming that the whole of the UK would transition to regenerative, organic, biological, choose your term, farming, and we calculated the impact that that would have on the amount of food produced, but also if we decided that we wanted to eat a diet which would be entirely from that productivity, what would that diet look like? And cut straight to the conclusions, the conclusion was that we could maintain our present level of consumption of staple foods if we ate a little less, if we wasted a lot less, and we ate differently. So we wouldn't starve, and that study needs to be extended throughout the world. But I think those people who are saying, oh, you'd never be able to feed the human population if we abandon chemical farming are just plain wrong.
Well, it's not really just chemical farming, is it? It's the industries connected with farming and food production, like fast food. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Is that better? Sorry. I was just saying it's not just about chemical farming, it's the invested interests of heavy industry, agribusiness, pharmaceutical industry. They're all in on it, and it makes huge, huge sums of money. So one's really up against something sort of a huge corporation versus small, diverse little farms.
Yeah, I think
that's really the problem, isn't it?
It's a key issue because this relates to the profitability of the sort of farming systems I've just been describing. If you farm intensively with a large dairy herd or a mega, monoculture of vegetables, you make much more money than if you're a small dairy herd like we are. And the reason for that is because it's now economics, but I think it's quite accessible really. The polluter doesn't pay, and the social and the climate and the nature benefits of the sort of farming that we do, we don't get rewarded for. So it's like you're not only up against uncosted, economists call them uncosted negative externalities, meaning you farm intensively, it causes climate change, it destroys biodiversity, and it damages public health. Do the farmers who use those methods, are they financially accountable for that damage? No. Whereas if we employ more people, increase the biodiversity in the fields which coexist with our crop production, improve public health, and address climate change, do we get financially rewarded for those benefits? No. So you're up, it's like a double headwind, and you cannot compete with that. And I was involved 40 years ago with developing the organic market. I mean, I literally wrote one of the first sets of organic standards for the dairy cows. And what we were trying to do, this is just shortly after we arrived on the farm in 1973, we realized we couldn't make any money because we were up against these subsidized intensive farmers. Yeah. So we thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll charge a premium, but tell all the people the story behind it. But it turned out the premium was so great that put most people off buying the food. So if we go forward to today, how big is the organic market? Less than 5%. And that's because the polluter doesn't pay and the farmers don't get rewarded. And we've just heard literally last week that Rachel Rees, and I'm pro-Labour, but Rachel Rees, because of the financial situation, she's cut all the support to farmers because she's trying to save money. So we're in a situation where it's bad already, but because of the economic crisis, it's likely to get even worse. So I think the only antidote to that, and I'll come to your point, India Jana, I think the corporates seem more powerful in this, but we're more powerful than the corporates would be the point that I made. Because if we all started, through our own knowledge of these issues, starting to say to governments, you've got to support proper farming, you've got to reward positive climate change outcomes, positive nature outcomes, blah, blah, blah. And also, if we could monetize the damage to public health done by these chemical farming systems, then the government will wake up, because the NHS treatment costs are threatening to bankrupt the health service. So if we could show that if we invest in regenerative and sustainable agriculture, which save NHS treatment costs, that would be really, I think that's the way to go. And I personally, I mean, maybe you disagree with this, Jane, but I've met a lot of the CEOs of these big food companies in the last 5 years.
Yes.
So I'm involved with a thing called the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which
We don't know about that.
was Prince Charles set it up in Davos, which probably you've got a view about as well.
Oh, yes, no, Davos.
So I'm going to Davos, so I'm part of the problem in a way. But I've met all these CEOs who are running the world's big banks and food companies. And what really strikes me is they are human beings, they've got the top job, they get sacked if they don't make more money than last year, and they're and their competitors are just pricing them down. So they're basically slaves to us, is my point. So if we carry on buying cheap food in supermarkets, then that forces them. I'm not saying they're great people, but I mean, they're just doing a job.
Well, yes, it's a way. But I have to interrupt you with one small interesting thing. I did a comparison with several people who ate only from supermarkets, very cheap food, ready meals and all this stuff, you know, little carrots cut into sticks and put into cellophane, and compared their monthly food bill with mine. And you know, theirs was higher. Their food bill was actually higher. It was just absolutely bizarre. I mean, I ate very well. I don't eat too much of.
But is that because you have skills that they don't have, you know?
Possibly. I mean, I grow a lot, but I don't eat, you know. I mean, I think if you eat this very degraded food with very little nutritional value, if any, that you're going to eat a lot more of it.
I think that's true. I'm sure that's true, because if these micronutrients that we crave for, actually, if we don't have enough of them, then our appetite isn't triggered. So I've certainly had the experience when you eat a food which is very, very high nutritious quality, you have it creates a sort of atmosphere in you that is very different from if you're just eating ultra-processed food.
So, shall we move now? Let's move on to our next phase, because the answers are not going to fall into our lap. We know that now.
No.
But what I realized, having nosed around the subject just before this talk, even though I have been immersed in growing food for quite a long time now, that people have a lot of creative energy and a great love of action, actually, and what a pleasure it would be to try to help this situation on a small scale, as individuals or small groups of people. It really is possible. And, you know, groups of you can really get a lot done. I don't see that I think a lot of it is seeing things through the prism of a massive corporation or a sort of faceless agribusiness, you know, thing. But it needn't be like that. And certainly when you're living in the country, as I know a lot of people here are living in the country, it's quite a different thing. It's quite a different thing. So it's really about how to feed people in cities.
Yeah, I think that's really important. My other daughter who's not here is Alice, and she works for a project called Growing Communities, which is based in Stoke Newington, and she's an organic grower. And Growing Communities have a policy of sourcing food from peri-urban farms. And so around London, there are lots of small farms, not all small, of course, but many of them are struggling to make it. And actually, if Londoners clubbed together and were absolutely committed to buy more peri-urban food, that would do the things you said. And also, as you also said, it might not be that much more expensive, because you cut out all these links in the chain.
Exactly. Eat less of it, I would say, and you kind of careful what you do with the weight. It's just a different attitude to it.
And also, it's so empowering, isn't it? Because if you, as you said, if you feel completely overwhelmed by these vast companies that are so sort of omnipotent that you can do nothing, you just feel, well, go to Tesco or whatever. You know,
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
and by the way, I'm not trying to exempt. You know, I'm a Tesco buyer. You know, I mean, I go to Tesco in Bristol because that's where I'm based in with the Sustainable Food Trust. And have I got vices of ultra-processed food? Yes, I definitely have. And do I buy stuff which is probably not very good? Of course I do. You know, I think we all do. So this is not a sort of, I think that your point about what can I do is the key.
Yeah.
You know, what's the route map out of this? And obviously for some people, price isn't a barrier, it's knowledge. You didn't know enough, so if you know more, then you can buy better food. For a lot of people, price is a barrier.
Of course, and it really is, yes, but it's even a barrier in, a very low-slung supermarket selling in bulk. Food banks are huge where I live anyway. It's really a very, very serious thing.
Yeah.
So how to, and it's a question of feeling, I think, how to feel a little differently about our land. And this is our land. It's land, skipping the word nature. It's our land which we love, and the sky which we love, and the sea, and lakes and rivers. And the feeling is there. And trees, who doesn't love trees? Who doesn't love this earth with its abundance? And somehow that's separated when it comes to shoveling food in. How to connect a little more and to give this thing we blithely call nature, and even I blithely use the word nature, I don't really know what it means. I mean, we're in spring now, and that England in the spring is one of the most beautiful countries, and all across Europe, this extraordinary force of nature. I know it happens every year, but in every tree, every blade of grass is this urge to become again. It's a huge force we're sitting in the middle of, but how to connect with it so that it's,
yes,
well, more kind, more elegant.
But also in relation to teachings and faith communities, so few of them are really strongly connected to these issues. I mean, some are, but there could be a lot more, I think.
Yes.
Because if you have a search, and that has found expression in your practice, and if it's right that eating degraded food affects, at least at some levels, your capacity to be more, to refine yourself. I'm not trying to sort of make it sound like a preaching, if you know what I mean, but I just think it does. I feel that for those of us who've been lucky enough to live on a farm, for instance, where you can eat very good food and experience the difference between that food and then eat food which might have been cooked even with very good attention but doesn't have a very good story behind it, there's a difference.
My thoughts go to Darwin a bit and how it really triggered a sort of love and a love of scientism, or the scientific thing explains everything. And I would give my thanks to Jeremy Nadler at the back of the room, because he really brings this home in his writing. But his story of evolution, yes, okay, but does it really explain the different levels that are possible? Does it really explain certainly cosmology does not come into it in any way. It's simply a story of chance, survival. But somehow my experience of nature is not that at all. I know in a forest the strongest tree will grow, but at the same time it shelters the younger trees. I don't know how you feel about Darwin, but
I didn't know him, but I mean, I feel that I think science is moving towards an understanding of some of the things that we've been discussing this evening. I don't see the barrier. I think that everything is connected, that nothing is separate, and that these fine energies, which we can gather in ourselves through persistent inner work and practice, that's science too. Everything's material. He speaks about this in Search of the Miraculous.
that's real science.
Yes, it's real science. So we must be talking about real science. And I think that if Darwin didn't understand this, it's just perhaps because he was a bit you know, he didn't know enough.
Well, I think the farmers in his day knew more than him.
Possibly some of them,
Possibly,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
How are we doing for time?
I don't know. Does anybody know the time? 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Oh, so we probably, do we want to open it up? And open
Well, we could do,
discussion?
yes. Yeah.
So my daughter wants to ask a question.
I've been trying to formulate it, but I feel like every time any of us eat this food that is sort of vital to species, we are connecting with all the people who have a part. So I think that the thing that we need to do is not feel guilty, actually, to forgive all the people who are doing it wrong. Because it's like an alchemy. If we do that, we'll transform the food we're eating, even though it hasn't got so much vitality, into something beautiful. And maybe in some cosmic, weird way, we'll somehow switch it from us to them. I don't know how, but I feel like if we just let go of that collective guilt and try and embrace, even if we're looking at a carrot on our plate that we know is farmed in a really cool way, just give it that love. I know it sounds a bit different, but I am a child of the 50s.
I think it is all about alchemy. I think the whole this is, everything's connected. It's possible to transform everything through love and attention and practice. I have a question for you. The question is, how can we help this along?
I think by being present when we eat and loving and forgiving of ourselves.
Transform everything through
Like really forgiving ourselves.
love
I think
and
when we do buy food that is not as vital, we make the choices away from maybe what we know we should be doing or supporting. But sometimes if we have no choice, there's very little choice within the supermarket. Because all the food, like you said, is not vital, or most of it. So we actually have to be a bit more gentle with ourselves, actually, I think.
Now, I'll just stand up so you can hear me. I have a question about the research study we published on organic farming, which said we wouldn't have to drastically reduce our consumption if we shift agriculture towards organic. But I have two questions. Number one, did your study look at
how that transition would affect like average food prices? Because I think that's the main reason people don't eat organic, right? You know, if 70% of your crops get wiped out and you can't use pesticides or whatever, then that's going to increase prices. Also, did your paper look at how the transition to organic would affect the total amount of land we use? Because we could, in theory, produce the same amount of food organically, or we'd have to probably use more land. Like, did your paper look at that?
yeah, it did look at the second point about land use.
Right.
And I think there's a wrong debate going on. It's a shame your half brothers aren't here actually, Jane, because both Ben and Zach Goldsmith are advocates of a policy called land sparing, which means we need to make more room for nature. And that's about rewilding, or it's about, you know, reforestation, or fencing off the edges of fields to grow wildflowers, that sort of thing. And I'm old enough to remember, and some of us here are old enough to remember, that back in the 50s, there was no need to have separate land because nature coexisted with food production. And so, yes, we've done all those calculations. We've assumed that there will be some land reforested, etc. But because you can produce really viable yields using a biologically based system, we can do it. But your first point, which is probably the key point, which is the cost issue. Because the answer is that I don't think we could do this transition without putting up the price of food by quite a lot. It's hard to estimate exactly how much, but let's say 50%. It'll vary between which crop. Some crops and some foods are easier to produce, not with that much more cost. But some foods are going to cost a lot more. And I'll give you an example, you might as well. So we are dairy farmers. We produce milk. I just read in a dairy farming magazine yesterday that the price of organic milk is 57.4 pence a litre. That's a really high price. Even the price of conventional milk is now 44, something like that. But let's say organic milk is a 25 to 30% price premium. But it gets worse than that. So we make cheese. Our cheese, which is a raw milk cheddar, is selling ex-farm at £16 a kilo. And you could go to Sainsbury's and buy mature cheddar for probably £11 a kilo, maybe somebody knows. But so our wholesale price is less than the retail price in the supermarket. And if you buy our cheese in Neal's Yard Dairy, it'll cost you £40 a kilo. So that's maybe even 4 times supermarket cheddar. And if you buy a chicken, a proper organic chicken, it should cost you a minimum of 4 times more. So I think the price is the big barrier. But what I mentioned earlier about, we also produced another report called The Hidden Costs of UK Food. And basically, the headline was, if you spend £1 on food in a UK supermarket today, there's at least another hidden £1 in damage to climate, damage to nature, and damage to public health, which isn't on that price. So food pricing is dishonest. You think we're getting cheap food, but we're not. But the problem is, if you're Rachel Reeves, she doesn't care, because she doesn't think the electric, probably rightly, she doesn't think the electric care about this. They just want cheap food because they're struggling. So I think, to your point, that's the problem. That is exactly the problem we've got. That if we had properly, honestly priced food, it would hurt.
I have a question. What are your thoughts about buying directly? I buy a veg box every week from Riverford Farms. That seems like a smart thing to do. It cuts out the big supermarkets.
I think it's exactly what we should all do. I think the issue is what we can all do. And I agree with Barney, it's not about guilt. It's about what you can do. It's about even a little thing that you can do. Because our collective buying power of food in this room is enormous. And if we all change and we influence the people around us, that's a huge change. So I think if you get a box at Riverford, you find, I was driving in here and saw an organic meat van, and I can't remember what it's called now. Anyway, there's lots of small farms who want to sell direct. And go online and find those products, make sure that it's got a good story behind it. That's the solution, isn't it? If enough of us did that, and also the government realised that growing treatment costs are previously really uncommon diseases, which are just going off the charts now, you could reduce some of the NHS treatment costs if you invested in better food. That's a longer term thing, but that's what ought to happen. But I think we have to start with what we can do.
I live in East Anglia, and all around me are incredibly intensively farmed fields. And you can walk along the lane out of the village, and you go up the hill, and it's all oilseed rape, which is, constantly, well, it's in flower in May. And when you walk up the road, there's not a bee in sight or sound. It's literally like the silent spring. And also we've got the wheat growing, intensive wheat, intensive barley, spraying like crazy, and the degradation of the soil is just unbelievable. I mean, I took a photograph like last year of the verge along the road, and the soil was black, and then literally beside it was the soil of the wheat field, which is literally kind of yellowy solid clay. And so obviously the natural humus has been, or humus, whatever it's called, has been lost. So if you tried to grow vegetables or something like that, you literally couldn't do it anymore. But my question is, how long would it take if you wanted to convert a field like that? I mean, we have subsidies available now to plant trees, but there's no subsidies to the farmer to have, I don't know, a 5-year changeover period. But, you know, what would that cost, and why does it have to be charged within the food industry? Couldn't another industry be subsidising that?
Yeah, I think
So that's my question.
I think you're right to point out how terrible the farming is in the east of England. As you said, there are mainly 4 crops grown now: Aussie grape, wheat, barley, and potatoes.
Sugar beet.
Sugar
Yeah.
beet,
Yeah.
potatoes. And most of those crops we don't even eat.
No, exactly.
Yeah, they're fed to animals.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, you wouldn't want to eat them because they're poisonous and they're horrible, really. And yet that's all of the best land in England is farmed that way.
Yeah.
How bad is that? And I think, to your second point, what could we do about this? I think one of the big points of entry is if we could measure on a regular basis the impact of the farming system on climate, on nature, and on social impacts, like a balance sheet. So if we do normal accounting, you have a profit and loss, and if you make money, there's the balance sheet. If you make money, it's on top of the balance sheet. But in agriculture, we haven't costed the balance sheet. So if you degrade your soil, or if you kill biodiversity, or if you cause greenhouse gas emissions, that's not counted. So if we were to develop a common framework of measurement, where every farm had to have an annual measurement of its, if you like, balance sheet of nature, on its soil, on its nature, on its social impacts. So that would include jobs, it would include education, it would include all the social things that farms can do. And you then you could, as you said, you could find companies, because there are a lot of companies now, banks, insurance companies, investment community, they want to buy carbon credits or things like that, but they want to be legitimate. So if you had a trusted framework for measuring the impact of farms, you could say to me, well, what was your sustainability score for last year? Like I said, it's positive on carbon, it was quite good on nature, it's not very good on water, it was whatever, very good social impacts. Then I could get a social credit for the social benefits I'm delivering in Wales. And interestingly enough, we've just been asked by the Welsh Government, this is the Sustainable Food Trust, to do a grower audit on the social impacts of small growers in Wales, because they've realised that even though small growers don't have a huge climate and nature impact, they have a massive social impact because of the vegetables they grow. We're involved with a project called Welsh Veg in Schools, where we're growing carrots on 2 acres, it will be this year, 1 acre last year, and they're all going to schools in Wales, and the schools are coming to visit the farms and look at the carrots. So the social impact of feeding better carrots to children to get them on the farms, the Welsh Government want to pay for that, but it all depends on measuring, and no one's measuring at the moment. So I was in a virtual meeting with a guy called Daniel Zeichen last week, who's the Minister of Agriculture, and he was the bearer of bad news that Rachel Reeves has just cut all the subsidies to English agriculture. And the president of the National Farmers Union, a guy called Tom Bradshaw, he said, well, you've got no baseline data, have you? And he said, I do agree with you, we should have had baseline data. So all these new farming schemes that are subsidising farming were happening until last week. There's no baseline data. So, I mean, how could you possibly spend taxpayers' money on agricultural subsidies when you've no idea what the impact is? That's what's happening. So I think your point is really critical, actually, that we need to find new ways of getting money, not government money, the government haven't got any money. But if we could find other people who would like to reward farmers, that would be a way forward.
Yeah, I think Zach and Ben actually that's the sort of project they'd
Ben
like.
would, yes, he
Ben
would.
would love that.
Yes, he would.
My brother.
So, yeah, Ben's so India Jane's half brother, Ben, is a well-known environmentalist, and also Zach, who was the environment minister in the Johnson administration.
Apparently, yes.
But they're environmentalists, but they're both friends. But I would say they don't. I think they need to see this in a more integrated way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We didn't talk about importing food at all, but it is called jet lag food. But I think most food produced here is like jet lag food. So.
Well, there was an interesting food programme item this week. Did anybody listen to the food programme this week? Dan Saladino is featuring a report by Professor Tim Lang called Just In Case. And it was about how the UK as a nation is incredibly food lacking. It has no food resilience. You know, if things packed up or the Russians sabotaged it or whatever, of course Heathrow happened the next day, our food systems, there's no security. I think.
Hi, I imagine most people in this room aren't farmers, and they're perhaps more into the spiritual side of life. That's just the vibe I'm getting. I might be wrong. When I've made big changes in my life, it's usually because of some kind of spiritual shift. There's been either more shift towards my coming into my body, or all sorts of things. But like the things that actually make me change my behaviour are those, and that's something that maybe the people in this room can actually do, because I think hearing you, you're like right in this industry, all the people, all the stuff, most people here don't. So what we can do is maybe shift people subtly towards their body and caring about nature in that felt way, and then that drives the change of all the rest, because just knowing you should do something doesn't actually often change behaviour. I've come to your conferences, Patrick, and heard you talk for years. And I don't know, it's only recently I've started making much better decisions about food, and that's because of the spiritual shift that was completely separate to all of that. Not completely separate, but something. And I just wonder, given the room, what you can say about it, because it's beyond the plate.
I think what you say, guys, is really important, because I was reflecting a couple of days ago that I've been saying more or less the same things for 40 years and nothing's changed. So that doesn't look good towards, whatever I've been trying to do hasn't worked. So what you're saying might be more significant.
Well, you come here all the time, you love this work, I just wonder whether the work is, we should believe in the spiritual work more, because I think we're often a bit like nervous about it, and a bit like self-conscious or shy about it, the fact that we're just weirdos that do the spiritual stuff, and it doesn't actually make much difference, and it makes a difference to us but not to other people. And I wonder if maybe that confidence in that it actually can make a huge difference in people's lives, it would help.
You mentioned at the beginning of the talk about the zodiac and growing food, and you haven't said anything about it. And another thing which I'd like to know is about seasonal vegetables and food, because you go to you go shopping and you've got a choice of just about anything, whereas we live in England and we grow a certain amount of food at different seasons, and we haven't taken into consideration that this is also a point that could be made, and you couldn't produce, or maybe you could produce food, organic food, depending on not depending on the weather and the seasons.
Yeah, well, I agree with you about the seasons, of course, and I would like to. It's probably better you read about the influence of the constellations of the zodiac on plant growth and how it divides up between Earth. I mean, it's all the this is connected to astrology or astronomically based astrology. So I don't feel that I'm the right person for you to learn from in that respect. But I agree with both your points that we need to be more sensitive to the influence of extraterrestrial bodies, the planetary bodies, and the zodiac and the constellations on organic life on Earth. And we also need to eat more seasonally, definitely.
Just jump in, there is a chart you can get, and we use it, and it could be a root day, or root morning, or a flower morning, or flower afternoon, and you only harvest the roots on those particular days. It's all been worked out. And I have noticed if you harvest the roots on the root day, keep them all winter. It does work.
Yeah.
But I don't think it tells you how it works. That you have to stay with it.
Where do you
Biodynamic Agricultural Association, they will publish it every year, I think, working with the stars.
Just an observation, I shop at the local farmers market, and since COVID, you know, the farmers market became very popular because everybody wanted to be outdoors. But I'm just reflecting, sitting here, on how the atmosphere of the market and the fact that they are farmers coming from Kent, Somerset, all over the place, makes a very strong atmosphere and relationship to what you're buying.
Yes.
You're buying from the producer.
Yes.
And I think, you know, urbanisation desensitizes you totally to feeling for what we're calling nature. But actually, I'm also very struck by this reminder of this word humus. You know, that we are the soil. And to me, this is the way which, like previous man said, what actually is going to influence you, in fact, change your orientation, and certainly contact with the growers is one thing, and being in nature. I was brought up in the country, and I really regret the loss of that influence on me. So,
the Sustainable Food Trust has just launched a network of beacon farms as educational platforms. And we hosted an event last year. We're going to host another one this year to bring those farms together, because I grew up in London, and when I was 5, my mum took me into a cowshed, and so it's back to Guy's point, isn't it? And it was an emotional experience, really, which took me back to the land. It wasn't just that, but that was the big one. So I like the smell and the atmosphere of the cowshed. So I think many, many millions more people need to have a direct contact with nature on farms. Not just nature, meaning nature is separate from farming, but farming, proper farming. And if enough people had those kind of experiences, they go deep, because nature feeds it. We are nature. So I think that's it, really.
yes.
There is a small network forming itself informally, and it's just about free food. It's a little network around me, and it's just people who grow food always have a surplus, always have too much of this, too much, and just put it out on the road. But you can now know where to get things, and then there are weekly places where a lot of growers, just normal growers, people like me or anyone here, and you just take food for free, and it's the most extraordinary experience, because you hand somebody your surplus tomatoes or herbs, and there's just this extraordinary moment of looking into each other's faces. This exchange has happened. There's no money. It's a wonderful thing.
I get that. I'm just thinking that the ordinary food shopper sees the food as something out there. Like it's a consumer item. It's like buying a motorbike or something else. You buy food and use it, but you don't feel part of the food. You're not connected with it, like you say. That is why you wouldn't be sensitive what you're eating. You just eat it and stuff it in.
I agree, but I think it's what are the interventions, and these may be what we're talking about now, that would make it needs to be different.
One of the interventions is education of people, and part of that is food labelling. Is that something which the Trust and other people and farmers look into? How do you tell people what they need to know?
Well, I think the food labelling system of the future needs to empower people to know where their food came from and how it was produced. And so if we were measuring, we could link that to a food labelling system, maybe. I think
We
there are
have a
lots of
question-
people who care about
We
this.
have a question back here. He's been trying to ask it.
Yeah. The Royal Society of Chemistry had an article called Cleaning Up the UK Drinking Water. Now obviously the water obviously helps with the transformation of vegetables from the farm. And the problem is that the water is damaged in the sense that it's got a lot of PFAS in it, which is from plastics, as you probably know. And the government claim that the water is fine, and yet the laboratories that used to test for water quality have gone out of business. So there isn't anyone to validate their proposals. What do you have to say about that?
Bad. I mean, there was a program about PFAS. It's really bad, isn't it? I mean, there's so many things going on now that are only just coming to light that are really terrible. I mean, what we do to nature, we do to ourselves, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, I think. Interestingly, all the rivers now in Wales, where we are dead.
Yeah.
They've been killed by agricultural pollution, and our cheese is called Havod, and it was named after a holding by a river that we've rented for 45 years. And only the last 2 years there have been and this was a salmon and sea trout river when we started. Now there aren't even any sticklebacks in it. It's a completely dead river. And this is true with the River Wye. Most of the rivers of the UK, certainly in England and Wales, are now dead rivers, and it's not wholly because of agricultural pollution. It's also because of what we flush down the loo. But I mean, it is a very serious situation. So we need to measure, and water and the measurement of the water quality leaving the farm would be one of the measurements. So the question is, what do we measure? And that would be one of them, I think. And it ought to be the water, the cleanliness of the water, but also how much of the water is used on the farm. So we need these metrics that make sure that we're collecting all this data that makes sure that farmers who do the right thing get rewarded for it.
Yes, what is the criteria for safe water?
Well, it would be obviously biological oxygen demand, but what you're talking about is more subtle than that, isn't it? Because it's plastic and chemical residues.
Chemical residues, which
Yes.
are not removed by the usual process.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
hormones as well.
Hormones.
Hormones, exactly. Yeah.
People that are affected by cancer,
Yes.
they can't eat Thames water.
Yes,
It's just
EPA.
they can't drink Thames water.
And Roundup, I don't know if you know, this mustn't get too depressing. I mean, glyphosate, which is the active ingredient of a herbicide called Roundup, if you drive around England, particularly in the winter, you'll see that all the fields look brown or orange, slightly orange. And that's because nearly all the fields, all the arable fields in England, get sprayed with a herbicide, which is called, the active ingredient is glyphosate, but often called Roundup, which kills all green plants. And the Roundup residues are in all our body fluids now. And there's been research which directly links Roundup residues in our bodies with growing incidence of previously uncommon cancers. So the real cost of what we've done to farming and food and nature, we're going to be paying for. You know, we're already paying for, but it's not. We don't connect it. So I don't know how many billions of pounds a year spent on cancer research each year, but it's vast. And yet, if we stop putting these chemicals on the land, you know.
And the glyphosate they were fined. The Monsanto, which was taken over by Bayer, were fined 10.9 billion for causing cancer to 100,000 people. And even as they settled 100,000, a further 70,000 had already added to the list. Like in America, everyone sues for everything. You know, this is what's going on.
Yeah.
And this country allowed it to go on for two more years, whereas in the EU, where Bayer is obviously a big influence, they have a 25-year lease more on glyphosate. 25 more years. Outrageous.
Well, a lot of these water companies are actually, well, the ones around me are owned by New York investment companies, and the water underneath is a huge aquifer. It's actually owned by the Canadian Water Board. Try ringing them up and complaining.
But I mean, maybe we should, I don't know if we've been going on a while, but I think we should assume that strong intention and just, there's the idea that if people are quiet together, an intention can be a massively strong influence, and just even having this exchange could make a really big difference.
I hope so.
I just think it's energy, isn't it, really?
I'd go and stay on a small organic holding. Just stay there for a bit, eat the food. You don't pick the carrots or weed the things, but stay there, eat a weekend. Very different.
Patrick, can I also say that going from off the plate to on the plate, because a lot of what you said is quite discouraging and depressing, and a lot of us here understand the concept of inner work. It starts, the data that you're talking about, or the experimentation that is taking place and needs to take place, all the scientific insight that needs to be corralled together and to produce real insight into how to bring about best quality food. But the processes that go on in us that make us appreciate what we're eating. For example, in a way you could argue that eating should join the slow movement, because we eat far too fast. Often you're with people who've got all the food out, it's gone before you, as you watch, and then you look at yourself and you think, well, actually I'm eating too fast because I'm nervous or whatever. I'm not actually tasting my food. And sometimes you can count the number of times you chew, and that's quite extraordinary. The experience of actually really tasting what you're eating, and that maybe is another way of seeing. That's the real way of tasting quality of food, actually, because if you chew it slowly, you can actually taste, whether it's actually palatable or not. And I think that it's on the plate is just as important as off the plate.
Exactly, and so eating with attention is not just a good thing to do. I mean, it's as I was trying to say earlier on, it's transformative as well, isn't it? Because if you're trying to work on refining yourself, then that's it. That's the whole of it, really. If the food is better and you eat with attention, then that's the beginning of the whole food table.
So I feel that in some ways, in order to change the food environment and to gain momentum, the children need to really learn. I know you were mentioning about that carrot project in Wales, but they need to really be taught in schools how to cook, because a lot of children have no idea how to cook at all, so they don't understand food. They wouldn't know how to make a cheap meal out of vegetables and pulses and things like that. And I think that's really sort of we almost have to go back to that, so that they start making the demands that they want better food and they understand it. I mean, I've heard in Japan, I don't know if this is true, but in the schools they'll have someone with them having their lunch and explain what all the food does for them and the nutritional value and all the rest of it, so that the children will start making demands of their own, that they want this because it's good for them.
We've got a chef working now with us who's hosting local children and teaching them how to cook.
Yeah.
And they've done the last 6 weeks. They've had them once a week cooking stuff that food that's grown on the farm or locally. I think it's right. We need to bring it to the curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And do you think you could make some of the information that you made about that we could grow all the food we needed and the hidden costs, which cost so much? Could you make that simple and
yeah, I mean, I've got
both for us to have to give to friends, but also for
you
schools?
can download that from our website.
Oh, really?
No, that's not very simple. That's it. That's the report.
Let's see.
Feeding Britain. Okay.
Yeah, And the hidden costs of UK food also on our website. This looks a bit dense. Well, it's a bit dense, but it's not.
Can you, because that would be good to give to school kids so that they learn early on what a difference it made.
I mean, there's a man called Richard Dunn who's working a project called the Harmony Project, which is launched by Prince Charles as he was. And basically his proposition was that nothing's separate, everything's connected, and these principles of harmony need to be taught to children to enable them to understand their relationship with nature. And he's working with schools all over the world, and he's got a project, like a manual for primary school teachers, which is now in 8 languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Ukrainian, Welsh, and it's subversive really, because it's trying to get the curriculum changed, because I think that's what we've got to do.
Is that on your website too?
The Harmony Project. If you just Google the Harmony Project, you'll find that.
What's your website called?
Ours is just Sustainable Food Trust. You'll find that easily.
So on that,
Just one more.
Sorry, that's okay. It's the first time I'm actually here, and I'm quite interested about it, because at the end of the day, I've come from a family that we've had our own garden, and up to 10 years ago, my parents started buying food from the supermarkets. I'd like to come to more of these in the future, but my question is probably for everybody at the end of the day, because what we're facing here, it's something that we probably have noticed too late in the process. It's been going on for a very long time.
Yes.
Now it's never too late to change something if we're changing it, whether it's one person, one family, one city at a time. But what are we all going to do from tomorrow? And one little change will make this better for our families. And obviously you don't have to reply to me on this, but it's more of an inside thing, because I've already made some notes myself to even go back to growing some things, even if I live in a flat, which I've done that before, and it tastes much better than in the supermarket by only having one little pot of something different. But it's maybe a question for everybody to think and reflect on this.
What a great reflection.
and it's
A little change, one
It's
change a
possible,
day.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very possible and very easy.
So maybe we can go downstairs, have a drink, sort of say that the food we've served up tonight, none of it from a supermarket. We start with packets kindly bought his own cheese, raw milk cheese, and then we have Tree Farm, which you know, Jameson, and they're pretty much donated all the charcuterie, small farm in Wales. And the bread is from Nutley Hall near me, and that is incredibly good bread. And the wheat is biodynamically grown. And the people who've made it, they're very mentally disabled, and some of them are very young, but they make the most outstanding bread. Really enjoy it. And the last thing is the wine. We've got some standard organic wine, which is perfectly good. And then we've also got this thing called natural wine. And these come from really, really small vineyards who otherwise don't really get much of a look in. And it has a rather quirky taste. So or someone will do that. And apple juice.